All right, let's get started. Welcome, everyone. Welcome back to Authors on Tap, where we host amazing writers in conversation with other equally amazing writers. I'm Javier Ramirez, and along with Kristen Gilbert, run Exile and Bookville here at 410 South Michigan Avenue, Suite 210 in downtown Chicago. I love saying Suite 210. It just makes our bookstore sound that much fancier. Let me introduce you to our esteemed guest tonight. Savannah Johnston is an enrolled citizen of the Choctaw Nation of Oklahoma. Her work has appeared in Gulf Coast, HTMLgiant, and Gravel, among others. She's coming to us from New York City. David Jackson Ambrose's debut novel, State of the Nation, was a 2018 Lambda Literary Award finalist for gay fiction. His second novel, A Blind Eye, was named by Lambda Literary as one of April 2021's most anticipated books. He has an MFA in creative writing from Temple University, an MA in writing studies from St. Joseph's University, and a BA in Africana Studies from the University of Pennsylvania. He's coming to us from outside of Philadelphia. So before we get started, I want to thank you all for tuning in, first of all, and we encourage you to keep your cameras on, but mute yourselves until the Q&A portion of the event. Use the raise hand function, and David will be happy to call on you, or type your question or comment into the chat, and David will pass that along to Savannah. You can purchase copies of Rites right here. It's a fantastic collection. I was going through it today. It's really incredible. Thank you so much, Savannah, for creating such an awesome. There you go. We all have one. You can purchase copies of Rites from Jaded Ibis Press through the link in the chat, which Kristen will be happy to post throughout the event. I'm going to pass this along to David now. So enjoy the show, and thank you guys for being here, and good luck.
Thank you. And Savannah, I want to thank you for allowing me to share this space with you tonight.
Thank you for coming, really, truly.
In reading Rites, for me at least, it seemed very much like an homage to an era or to people that, you know, maybe are no longer really, they no longer exist. This could be, of course, my own, what I'm bringing to it, because it evoked a lot of memories of my childhood and such. So, you know, I really usually hate when people ask me this question. What were your intentions with writing these stories?
Well, I really wanted to capture a sense of place. And I hope I did that unified in the collection of just kind of exploring the many different kinds of lives that people in Oklahoma, especially Indigenous people, are living. And I mean, you're correct. They are most likely not living those lives anymore, because I did really draw extensively from my own experiences growing up in the 90s in Oklahoma, which is, you're just feeling the backlash of the 80s, which was oil boom, party, and like the party was over in the 90s. And that's really where I imagined most of the stories taking place. Like, I know there's now, in the age of cell phones and social media, there's not a single cell phone in this collection. Most of the cars there's not a hybrid, they're old. And I think also that's really what I was going for in evoking a specific time and place. And this is very much like what I remember and how I remember experiencing Oklahoma, and just kind of that hardscrabble kind of life in a time before we were all so digitally connected, where we were always just plugged in. Like, it was a much more isolating time, I think. Obviously, social media can do its own sort of isolation, but for this, I really was kind of focusing on trying to evoke more of an era and not really having it be tied to like a specific, like post-millennium time. I hope that came across.
Yeah. It seemed that way to me. I mean, I have never been to Oklahoma, but it very much captured, you know, this my experience in the suburbs of Philadelphia and Pennsylvania. So it really was, it did evoke a lot for me. So you mentioned the lack of cell phones and such, but in their place, there were a couple of things that it may strike you as odd that I want to ask about. But for example, let's talk about sage and what sage means for you in writing your stories. I mentioned that because I've used that also in my book. One of the characters burn sage for specific reasons. So I just want to know what that meant for you.
Yeah, well, I mean, smudging is a very personal thing. Sorry, my dog. Smudging is a very personal thing, and I think it means something different for every individual, depending on their own like tribal context or if they were raised around it. Like for me, it was something that I experienced mostly at funerals as a means of cleansing before going in and basically beginning the public grieving process. But I know a lot of people who do it in their homes or like in the new year. And for me, I think it is really just like a sense of like maintaining like a spiritual cleanse of sorts. But like I said, it means something different for everyone. Some people do it in their homes just when they're feeling down, and other people do it ritualistically. But there's a scene in Res Dogs where the kids are mourning their friend and they smudge themselves before they go and have their own little memorial. And that's really what I think it means to me is it's about really just kind of centering yourself and opening yourself up to the acceptance of losing that person. I mean, I know that features pretty prominently in the first story, Rites.
Yeah. Yeah, it had that meaning for me too, but it also, for some reason, along with the title Rites, it sort of, to me, evoked the ancestors, and that's sort of how I used it as well, sort of this communication with those who are no longer there. So
yeah,
it really resonated for me. When you are creating your stories, does the story come first or do the characters? How does it usually develop for you?
I mean, I would say I waffle between both ways. There are some characters that just come to me, but like particularly for Revolutions, like I pictured the friendship between those two little girls first. Those two came to me, and I was like, I need to put them in a place. But I would say more often than not, it's more of a concept. Like I start with an image. Like I would say for Shells 1, it's really that image of that enormous turtle and the possibilities that evokes. And then I would say for Shells 2, the image that I had was just an image of a child witnessing a parent that they don't necessarily like really come into her own power, and kind of just being struck by that power in that moment in the climax of that story. But yeah, I would say I either start with an image or more of a concept. And sometimes it can just be like to challenge myself. That's how Carrion came about, was I wrote that story as a challenge to myself because some aspect of that story, I can't quite remember what, a peer in a writing workshop told me like, you can't do that. And I was like, you sit down and you watch me. And that's what I did with that one. But yeah, I think concepts and images are really important to me in stories. I tend to think cinematically. So that's really how I kind of start. It's like that opening scene. I'm definitely one of those people who I hear a song and I'm already picturing like, if this were a music video.
Yeah.
And so that's really where I start when I'm writing fiction.
So for Clarion, do you recall, was it that they told you maybe you can't write from a male perspective or something like that? I have to say that was one of my favorite stories. I really did I like that one a lot.
Thank you. I think it was like of a young boy. It was a man who told me that I couldn't write that accurately, and I kind of took that on head on because as you can see, most of my child protagonists are girls, young girls, and that was really more of a challenge to myself to see if not only I could write a little boy, but also a little boy completely detached from like contemporary society.
Yeah.
Who's being raised with like a completely different set of values and a different set of skills than you would expect, which perhaps made it easier to write him because he's not a little boy from Denver or something, you know?
Yeah, but part of what I liked though, it reminded me a lot of like Cormac McCarthy, The Road, and Faulkner, As I Lay Dying, even a little bit of Alice Walker, the Third Life of Grange Copeland, just this solitary boy that you follow his story and what he's doing. He doesn't even seem childlike for the most part because, you know, he's dealing with very adult things. But that's the case with a lot of the children in your writing. And that really, it was really something that struck me.
Thank you. I appreciate those comparisons. I mean, I know it's kind of a cliche at this point, but I think children really do see more than adults give them credit for, and they're far more perceptive. And I think in our lives in general, we tend to underestimate them and what they're capable of. Not that any child should be put through a lot of the things that happen in my book, but they're resilient. And I think that's one of the major themes throughout all the stories, the adult protagonists and the children, is resiliency and the strength of like the human spirit under duress.
Right. I don't know if it's my own innate misogyny, but that was one of the things that I like to. When you depict your young girls, there's not a sentimentality to them. There's no, you know, there's not like these girlish traits you read in a lot of other stories. They're just depicted very matter-of-factly, and that's sort of how I've always envisioned, you know, my childhood. So I was happy to see someone writing children that way. Don't see that a lot, or I don't.
No, I appreciate that. I'm really not going for sentimentality, as you can probably tell.
Yeah. Something along the same lines as The Sage, something that I noticed, some of your character, I may be putting a little bit more emphasis on these things because I'm thinking of my own writer's process. But like, how do you decide if an individual is going to, you know, smoke a cigarette or not? Because for me, it sort of came really naturally that certain characters would smoke, even though I never have, and I don't know why. It just came to me that way. So how do you reach those sort of decisions in your writing?
I think smoking cigarettes is not necessarily like, it's not a symbol of anything, but it is something that becomes very automatic. I am an ex-smoker. I grew up around smokers. Everybody I know was a smoker. And it becomes just kind of an automatic thing that becomes just part of how people communicate and how they use their body when they're just simply existing. And so it kind of just came really naturally of just like, oh yeah, of course, Hippie's gonna smoke now because he's anxious, and Joe's gonna smoke now because he's on a smoke break. Like, it's kind of arbitrary, and it fits to whatever the character is doing at that time. It could be something just automatic, or it could be something that they're doing to calm their nerves, or because they're like stressed out, or even, I'm ashamed to say this, but a celebratory cigarette.
Yeah.
Which,
well,
like, I remember from when I was younger was actually a thing. And I just think it depends on the character, really, on when and where they would consider that to be an appropriate thing to do.
Yeah. Well, I was reading somewhere, an actor, I forget who it was, who was saying that a cigarette is like the greatest prop for acting there is. And so I don't know, for me, I probably use it that way. You know, I imagine someone just waving a cigarette around, you know, as part of the entire thing. So I just wondered, you also use pets. That's something that I've done a few times myself. So I wondered if that was a deliberate choice or if that happens organically.
It was a deliberate choice in each story, but it was only when I put them together that I realized that most of these people have animals or have some sort of relationship with animals in the natural world. At the time, I was just like, yeah, give them a dog. But I think the relationships we have with animals are important in that they often can reflect how we do treat or how we neglect our relationships with other people. It's probably something I saw on Twitter, but it's like, I think you can judge a person by how they treat animals. And I mean, you don't even have to be a dog lover. It's just like considering how you would treat something that is so vulnerable to you. And I mean, babies are not animals, but I do think that translates to how we understand children. Is what would you do with this life that would absolutely depend on you? And how do you react to that responsibility? And I think that can really work for character in terms of, like, say, Tennessee, like, he loves his dog. Like, that is his best friend. And in his time of stress, when he's alone, that's his major companion. And the decisions
But he also propelled, he also propelled the story.
Yes, exactly. I didn't want to give it away, but it's like also the decisions he has to make, like they're heartbreaking, but at the end of the day, like, he's choosing to do that for both of them, not just him. It's as a means to go forward.
Yeah. It helped to pull me into as well. Although I absolutely love Tennessee, but the pets helped to pull me in, definitely. So what's your research process? I mean, do you do a lot of research? I mean, I know you're writing from your own experience, but does research factor in?
Sometimes it really does. When I was first drafting some of these stories, I went into a major rabbit hole of what was airing on network television on specific nights of the week in these years and these months, because I wanted it to be reflective of the era that I was picturing without them being like, the date is July 7th, 1993. Like, instead of that, I wanted to be able to have like cultural touchstones that perhaps maybe too specific, that would still be reflective of that reality. But in terms of like other research, I do a lot of geographical research. I mean, a lot of the places mentioned in the book are real, fictionalized versions of themselves, obviously. But if I were portraying a particular town or something like that, like, I would want to look at the area, the landscape, get an idea, because I mean, memory is faulty, and we paint a lot of pictures about the things that we remember that aren't necessarily accurate. And particularly in terms of the Ouachita Mountains, I did a lot of research for that because I haven't been there in a number of years, and I wanted to have an accurate representation of the topography and have at least an understanding of where, mostly for my benefit, everything was taking place exactly in the coordinates, so that I could kind of map it visually and put that on the page. But that's honestly where a lot of my research comes from, is making sure it's specific to the era, or if any contemporary or historical event is occurring in that piece, I want to make sure it's reflected accurately. I'm not about misinformation. Right. And my fiction is very realistic, so I do try to work with that in the process.
Right. Do you have any favorite characters, or which of the stories do you favor over others, or are they equal?
Well, I do. The title story, Rites, is actually probably my favorite story in the collection. And that's the one that was more drawn from personal experiences. And I mean, obviously completely fictionalized, but that's really that's what I wanted to encapsulate the collection as. It's like, this story, I think, best reflects what I was going for with the collection, and kind of a reflection of a family grieving, going through it, but coming out the other side. And I also think it's one of the funnier stories, and we love to laugh.
Yeah. So I was asking you if you would mind reading a piece for us, if you read some.
Yeah, I would love to. I'm going to read a bit from Revolutions, which I mentioned earlier. The summer I turned 9 was the year my mother decided that I could be trusted to handle myself in public. In truth, she had let me run the empty streets of our neighborhood since I started school, but in public, she always made a show of keeping her hands on my narrow shoulders, steering me like a buggy through the grocery store. I had already explored the swampy frog pond that separated our part of town from the country, the abandoned mill with its rusty, hollow silos, and the old chicken hut across the railroad tracks. If she knew where I'd been, she didn't ask, though she asked me a few times to keep my knees clean. When the free fair and carnival came around in early August, I was anxious to try out my new freedom. The fair wasn't free, like its name suggested, and it was no powwow, but the lights and the rides and games would run all weekend long. Every year, my mother would herd me from kiddie ride to kiddie ride, while she gossiped with one of her friends, whistling through her teeth if she thought I'd wandered too far off. The kiddie rides were always a disappointment. A half-painted spinning bear whose red and white suspenders were pink and cream from the sun. A clacking train ride that boasted a 5-foot peak and had a penchant for getting stuck at the top. And a swing ride, which I never rode after that time in first grade when Violet Shangrove forgot to latch the crotch buckle and slid right out of the swing just as the machine hit full velocity. She only broke an ankle and her left wrist, but that was enough to scare me off the swing ride for good. That year, I had a growth spurt and was finally tall enough to ride the green machine, the only ride that wasn't torn down and stored away over the winter. It ran on a converted John Deere tractor engine, and it had 2 egg-shaped capsules at the ends of welded steel arms that swung up and around like I imagined David's slingshot from the Bible story. It was exhilarating to watch. Some pimple-faced farm boy would kick the motor on, and the dusty black belts would rumble and begin to whir so fast as to appear still before the arms began to swing. Shanice, my best friend, when she happened to be staying with her grandmother, which was often, already made me pinky promise that we would ride the machine together. We went to the fair on the second night, a Saturday. I asked my mother's boyfriend, who I called Uncle Pablo, to tie my hair up in a tight bun on the top of my head, and he used one of his red bandanas to hold my hair back from my forehead. In school, we learned about the textile factories in faraway New York and Boston, and how the people who worked there would get their hair sucked into their machine's gears and pulled out from the root. I imagine the whirring, swinging parts of the green machine catching my waist-length hair and taking my scalp with it, or worse, more. My Uncle Pablo laughed at me when I told him that, but he tied his bandana around my head just the same. As we walked the quarter mile from our little A-frame in the old part of town, my mother and Uncle Pablo leaning on one another as they went, I ran a few steps ahead. Once we hit those fairgrounds, I'd be home free. I planned how to spend my $5 worth of tickets. The tilt-a-whirl first, I thought, then the spider ride, with its middle painted like a black widow's belly. And then, for 3 tickets, the green machine, or maybe the Ferris wheel instead of the tilt-a-whirl. But I knew Shanice would say that the Ferris wheel was for babies. My mother whistled for me to slow up as a line of white vans drove past. I stopped and watched, taking a step back into the grassy ditch. There were 5 of them, mostly identical, but for a few differences in year or wear and tear. Tall white vans like you see at churches. The orange street lamp shone dimly through the dark windows, revealing silhouettes of broad-brimmed hats in one van and square bonnets in the next. I was used to seeing the Mennonites around the fair every year, but their presence, all of them dressed so alike, always startled me at first. They weren't like the other white people in Caddo County. They didn't just ignore the rest of us. It was more like they pretended we didn't exist. They kept to themselves on their dairy farms, owned their cows and the land outright, drove their own milk tankers, and seemed to prefer to have as little to do with the rest of us as possible. My mother said that was because of their religion, but Uncle Pablo said it was because they didn't like Indians. Thinking of the girls' milk white hair caps, how the caps came just over their ears, I touched my own ears sticking out from beneath Uncle Pablo's bandana. My ears felt hot. And I'll stop there, and you can buy the book if you want to finish it.
Thank you. I really did enjoy that story because there was the African-American girl. And so I'm not an African-American girl, but I saw myself in that. So I wondered, is there a consideration of like assimilation when you're writing? Like, do you think of a specific audience, or do you, is your writing focused towards a specific audience?
Sort of. I mean, I do believe it is important to center Indigenous people in these stories, but at the same time, I want to showcase the interconnectedness of the communities in Oklahoma, the interconnectedness of Afro-Natives, African-Americans, the Native community, and like the coexisting white communities that are all around there. Like, Oklahoma is an incredibly diverse place, and I like to think of it as kind of how you imagine like a Google Map overlay. Like, we have Tulsa, which is a very historically important city for Black Americans and is still very much a Black American city. But right outside that, you have the Muskogee Creek Reserve, you have the Iowa Nation, you have the Cherokee and Choctaw Nations, and then you also have just regular towns, like they are all over the country, like regular white dominated rural towns. And all of these places, like they coexist at the same time in this space. And it's something that I really haven't experienced elsewhere, is just these communities literally living on top of each other. And there's a different set of rules for everyone, but at the same time, all of these rules apply mostly to the non-white communities at all times. I say that because like the McGirt decision recently at the Supreme Court ruled that Oklahoma has been violating tribal sovereignty since 1907. Like our reservations were never disestablished. Those are still our nations. And that's unsettling for some people to know that they've been living on occupying stolen land. And I think also that history of Oklahoma directly ties into the history of the race riots in Oklahoma, particularly like the Tulsa Race Massacre, which we're only just now putting out in the public. When I was growing up, I didn't find out about the Tulsa Massacre without looking it up myself. It was not taught. And we had to take a whole class called Oklahoma History, but Oklahoma history only went up to about the 1930s. And even then, 1921, come on, where is it? It's not there. That's not the story that they were interested in telling, at least in the textbooks I had. And right now, I think there is a really big push in Oklahoma to reintegrate Indigenous people's history and Black Americans' history in the state, because those are the people who were literally there first through displacement, through being further like couched in by like colonization and just like basic land theft. God forbid they find oil. And then you have these histories that have just been completely erased because the narrative is the settlers. The high school I went to, the pioneers. Like there was land run day in elementary schools where little children of all races would be made to reenact a land run in the playground. And I think I'm writing for people who that's not their story. You know, that's not how they ended up here. They ended up here through enslavement, forced walks, the kind of trauma that I think really does force a community to rally around itself. And I mean, that's really who I think my audience is. I mean, I hope my audience is. Obviously, I'm a writer. I wrote a book. I want everyone to read my book, but it's not written for, and this is not a diss, but it's not written for like people whose favorite author is Sally Rooney. Like, that's not who I'm aiming at.
And the textbooks that you refer to, would they be available to like grammar school children, or was that more towards like college? Because for me, you know, a lot of Black history wasn't really taught to younger children. You got Martin Luther King, and that was sort of it. And it was up to you to educate yourself as you got older. So what is available to the children there?
I would say when I was a small child, we had like, obviously like Ruby Bridges, Rosa Parks, all the big names for Black history. For Indigenous history, it was Sequoia and like other like Pocahontas and Powhatan and things that were just so far removed from the reality of what we were living then. But the Oklahoma history class that I took, I believe I took it 8th grade. So you're not a kid, but well, I mean, you're still a child, but you know what I mean? You're not 6 being taught this, but I do feel like there have been some strides made in elementary education, in particular with just kind of an explosion of picture books and like middle grade and YA novels that don't focus on the trauma. It's not all the stories of Martin Luther King or Rosa Parks in a simplified way. It's just stories about Indigenous children and Black children having their joy. And I think particularly younger kids need that exposure. They need to know that it's not all just like this person was horribly wronged and they overcame it. It's like we need more than that story, which is one reason why I did write these stories, is because I think there are 101 ways you can live your life, and every one of those stories is valuable. And that's really what I was trying to do over the course of the book.
Yeah.
But to go back to your question, I do think it's getting better, but I agree. I didn't learn a lot of the true histories until I was much older and doing my own research.
So the area though where you were, I sort of got the impression that there were a lot of different cultures sort of commingling, or was it segregated? It was commingled.
Well, it depends on the space, really, because the capitals of each sovereign nation, they're also white towns. Like the capital of the Cheyenne Arapaho Nation is Clinton, Oklahoma. So obviously there are a lot of Cheyenne and Arapaho citizens there. They have a huge Indian hospital, IHS. But at the same time, there is a very large white population, and there is a smaller Latino population and a smaller Black population. But with the way that the state came about, any old idea of like a reservation town, basically without legal structure, they just said, yeah, no, that's not how that is anymore. We can come if we want. And through the disestablishment of the reservations and through the Dawes Act, there was a real push to buy up land from the indigenous and Afro-Indigenous people who had their allotments. And they would have agents who would basically scam their entire families out of it. And that's how you end up with these ranchers. The pioneer woman who lives near Pawhuska, her husband, his whole ranch, that's land that they bought directly, his ancestors bought directly from the Osages. And like they currently contract with the federal government to graze wild horses there. And they're getting like hundreds of thousands of dollars for that, but that's not their land. And it was obtained under very circumstances. But that's how a lot of Oklahoma actually came to be what people think of when they think of Oklahoma. I mean, the musical, obviously, like that's how those people, if we're putting it in the full context, that's how they were there at that time. But
Right.
it's actually interesting to me, the man who wrote the book or the play that Oklahoma was based on, he was indigenous. And when he wrote it, he placed it in specifically Indian territory. And it was only for the musical that they upped it and it became like an all-white town and actually called Oklahoma. Like that's not where Green Grows the Lilacs takes place. Like it was sanitized for the Broadway audience.
Yeah. Something that I did notice in your writing, although it is primarily indigenous people, you did not go to lengths to describe, skin tones or color. And that stood out to me because I read from an assumption of whiteness because that's what's been indoctrinated from reading since childhood. So I appreciated the fact that you didn't feel the need to tell us who these people are in that overt way. There were other indicators, and I really did like reading it that way, the way you depicted them.
No, I appreciate that. I kind of feel the same way. Like when I was growing up reading, I also watched a lot of Disney movies. So it's like in my head, like that's how I'm visualizing things. Like that's how my imagination is going. Like I had a real obsession with Judy Garland in The Wizard of Oz when I was a little kid. And like I demanded to be called Dorothy for a while. It's fine. We moved past it. But that's how I was visualizing the world as well. But that wasn't the way that everything was in the real world. So there was this real disconnect for me between like movies, television, and books and real life when I was growing up. Like it was just definitely a fantasy life. And I think as I got older, I recognized that in myself as like, why am I reading things this way? And it's like, well, if we want to actually reflect reality, like we're not all running around like shouting like our skin colors. And I also find it kind of gross when people describe people's skin colors as foods. It's weirdly fetishistic and I don't enjoy that. But I think there are other ways to contextualize people and their ethnicities and their cultural competencies without focusing just on their physical looks. And I think it was also important for me with this book because Indigenous people come in all shapes, colors, and sizes. We have Black natives, we have white natives. I'm Native. This is what I look like. And I think it's important to recognize that is that there is a diversity and we don't have to fetishize people or make them carry around like a giant banner declaring their ethnicities. Like there are other ways to do that. And I think that also speaks to who I was writing the book for. Because I was writing the book for people who would recognize that. That is, you don't necessarily need a giant flashing arrow pointing at the character to define them. Like you should be able to use other clues. And it's not something that should be the one aspect of their character. Like it's very important to me that I'm Indigenous. And in a sense, I do think it's important for many of my characters. But at the same time, it's not something that is the sole bearer of their personality or their actions.
True. Well, we're moving towards the final portion of our Q&A. So I wanted to ask a few lighter questions. Well, I wanted to know, what are you reading right now, if anything?
Okay, it's kind of embarrassing. I am reading The Maple Murders, a Riverdale mystery, because I needed a break. And that is the last book I bought. It was an impulse buy when I was like, something fun, just a little treat. And so I am reading that. And it is a lot of fun. It's like cotton candy for your brain. You can just kind of check out. I am really looking forward to reading. I've already started Toni Jensen's memoir, Carrie. I just did an event with her. And she's just such an incredible writer that I am looking forward to finishing that. And I just ordered Donna Mascolta's Angie Rubio stories, which is also published by Jada Davis. And I heard her read from it. And I hadn't had the chance to get the book yet. It hadn't arrived. So I'm really looking forward to reading those stories.
And who would you say are your favorite authors, or who inspired you to write?
I mean, it's hard to pick like a favorite. I mean, obviously storytelling, like one of the first big books I read was the Wizard of Oz series. Like I was really into the fantasy and the storytelling of that, just kind of like an adventure novel. But I also really like Matt Johnson. I could reread him, any of his books. I could reread them. I actually just saw on Twitter today that he has a new book coming out next summer. I'm very excited about that. Him is his favorite book of mine. I know these books are nothing like mine, but I really, really enjoyed that. And then I would say my most recent fave, well, no, let's go back. Not a most recent fave. Louise Erdrich's La Rose really helped inform how I was structuring the book. I don't know if you've read it. It's an incredible story about a mixed Indigenous family, and there's just such perceptiveness in the way that she writes the child, La Rose, and you get the other characters' perspectives, the adults, and just kind of delving into the histories of these characters and why and how they've ended up where they are. And I definitely used that as an influence when I was editing the book, in a way of trying to, like, it's a short story collection, so I can't chart a character's full arc, but just dropping in little crumbs here and there so you can see where someone may have ended up or how they ended up where they do in another story. And I really think that book is just incredible, and I recommend it to everyone.
I realize that's a hard question because now I think about it, my faves probably change every month. So
Yeah.
I get that that's difficult.
Yeah.
Yeah. So even, all right, I had even lighter, I wanted to ask you these questions. I know they weren't going to make any sense at all, but I wanted to ask anyway. Beach or mountain?
Mountain. There's probably a river there, and the beach is terrifying.
Why? Because of the waves?
You can't see the bottom.
Okay.
And the last time I was at an actual beach, a manatee swam by me about 10 feet away, and it was going so fast that all I could think was like, what is it running from? Because I'm not going to be able to see that.
Yeah.
And then I got out of the water.
Pie or cake?
Pie, always. I had wedding pie. Like, that's how much pie is better than cake.
Your wedding?
Yeah, my wedding, we had pie. Strawberry rhubarb,
That's
peach
awesome.
pie, the best pies.
Movie theater or streaming?
I love going to the movies.
Yeah.
I love the terrible, unhealthy, overpriced snacks. I love the big screen. And just, I like seeing horror movies in the theaters. Just because there's something about being terrified in a room of people, which obviously we haven't had a chance to really do lately, but one of my best friends and my partner and I, we like to go to like early matinee movies when we can, because they're cheaper and they're mostly empty now. But it's just so much fun to be in the dark with your friends and scared. Like, we saw Candyman together in a mostly empty theater, and my God, the phobias that could be triggered by that film. But it's also
Newest
40
one?
feet high.
The newest one?
Yeah, the newest one.
Yeah. Okay.
It's good, but
Yeah.
if you have trypophobia, don't go.
Okay. I feel the same way about theaters. I went to see A Quiet Place. It would not have been the same experience at home. So I agree with you there for horror movies.
Yeah, I saw A Quiet Place there too, and it wouldn't have been the same if I was watching it in my house, like half scrolling through Twitter, like
Yeah.
half paying attention. The dog just like running around, like, no, it wouldn't have been the same.
Yeah, especially if there's a terrified person sitting way in the back and you hear them screaming, that just really increases the anticipation. So
Yeah, it definitely sells it. The collective gasp.
Yeah.
Like, that's what makes it fun.
Yeah. Ebook or hard copy?
Well, I would prefer a hard copy. Because of the pandemic, I got really into downloading books on my phone through the New York Public Library's app.
Mhm.
Like, apparently so did everyone else, because it got bad enough that they capped you at 3 books, which it used to be 10. But I mean, there's just something a little bit easier about reading a hard copy to me. But I mean, obviously through act of necessity, I did get really into ebooks this past 2 years. So I would have to say ebooks for now, but only because I can't go to the bookstore.
Yeah.
Well, I guess now I could, but for a long time I couldn't.
Yeah.
And the library was also closed. So
Yeah. I will always love a hard copy because it's easier to take notes and to scroll in them. But ebooks have become so much easier when you just put your finger on a word and then you get the definition when you need it. And a lot of times authors of color are not easily available at bookstores. So it's a lot easier to get them on an e-reader, but I still always prefer hard copies. Yeah.
No, you're definitely right. Like, I've struggled with that, trying to find books by authors of color that I've stumbled upon on Twitter, and I have to order it. Like,
Yeah.
I have to have it, but it's not being carried in the store. I don't want to support Amazon, but I guess Bookshop is really kind of filling that void now.
Yeah.
So you can get small press books through them, and that's really great. I'm very happy for them.
Yeah.
That's just making it a lot more accessible without feeling like you're giving Jeff Bezos money.
Right. Oh, one more, my closing. Michael Jackson or Prince?
Prince.
Prince.
Always Prince. That is the correct answer. I'm sorry.
Same here.
Always Prince. Purple Rain is a masterpiece. You can't fight people on that.
Yeah. Controversy before that too. I love that from start to finish. So yeah.
Yeah.
Definitely.
Just rest in peace.
Yeah. So I'm not sure if we have questions or if they're going to come up in a different screen. I'm not sure how that's going to be available. Let me see if I can find them. Two in the chat.
Yeah, they would come up on the chat. Maybe there just aren't any. You guys can keep talking about Prince and Michael Jackson. And I will
So-
say that I have this ongoing conversation with a writer friend of mine, Jasmine Drain, and we always argue about Prince and Michael Jackson. I'm Prince all the way. I think they're both extremely talented
Yes.
artists, but Prince, yeah, there's just
Hands down.
just yeah, he's just that much more, and
Right.
he's like incredibly talented. But carry on. I wanted to interject there.
So where's your creative space? Where do you find it easiest to do your writing, or do you everywhere?
Get him, please. Sorry. I honestly write pretty much everywhere. Like, especially, I was late to the smartphone game, to be quite honest. So I used to carry around a little notebook, just like a little steno pad.
Yeah.
And I would fill those up with notes, and then just eventually, usually at my house on my couch, or when I was in grad school at the library, just like transcribe my notes and kind of just put my thoughts down in a Google Doc and leave it there. But now that I have a smartphone, I don't have to carry around a little notepad, and I have my notes app that I write in. And then obviously, because it's a smartphone, I can just transfer that directly into a Google Doc and then transfer that to my computer and work from there. So it's gotten a lot easier. Like I said, I was late to the game, so I kind of held on to my little notebook for longer than I should have, probably out of pure spite. But yeah, so that's really what I do. And I mean, I live in New York, so if I'm out and about, it's just easier to be able to whip out my phone and take some notes.
You write on your phone? I can't imagine.
Just notes.
No, okay.
Yeah, but I mean, like I have a couple working Google Docs that I can access through my phone. So it's easier for me to take notes like that. Like I wouldn't say I'm extremely forgetful, but it's like when you're falling asleep and then you're just like, I have a brilliant idea. I'm going to remember this tomorrow.
Yeah.
Like, no, you're not. Like, that's when it's a good time to pull out your phone and just jot something down. Because I'm not getting out of bed to get a pen.
Yeah. I have a notebook by my bed because no, my memory is shot, but yeah, those are the times when the best ideas come. So,
yeah. And then the next day you're just like, what was my brilliant idea for a book?
right.
Like, what was it? But yeah, so I find that really helpful. And
Yeah.
I'm also like a list person where I don't necessarily do this for stories, which I tend to write more organically. But I've recently been working on a novel, and it makes a lot easier for me to plot it out by just creating a list of like, and then, and being able to kind of build off that framework. I use the
So
same
you do
thing
outline first. You do outlines for, well, this is
for
you said
big
your
projects.
first. Okay.
Yeah, for bigger projects. Like when I wrote a novella, I started by basically writing a log line for each chapter as I wanted to go, and then built from there. But for a short story, I feel like just because of the compression of the form, it's a little bit easier for me to just be like, there doesn't have to be like this huge narrative change. Like, it's a short story, it's just a clip. So it'd be easier to just let it go and see where it goes naturally. But for something like a novel, I personally feel like from my writing process, I need a bit more structure. I need to know where I'm going. I can't just be flying blind, or else I'm going to end up with 150 pages and we haven't left this room.
Yeah.
You know?
And your stories and Rites were very episodic, and I really like that because I sort of, in my longer pieces, I still have an episodic mindset. So when I'm writing, so I did like that. It reminded me a lot of the way.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think that translates to how I've been drafting this novel and how like I drafted the novella that I wrote, which is the log line. You just have to, I view the collection as like a limited TV series, kind of. Like it's an anthology of these experiences. But when I'm like with the novel I'm working on, I view that more as like a full season of TV, but with all the same characters, obviously. Like this isn't like just an anthology. There has to be a strong narrative arc following the protagonists, which there might not be two when I finish this draft, but because it's a lot of work. I don't want it to be too bloated, but I do think about it as like next week on this book.
Same here.
Like,
That's the fun for me, thinking about the continuation. But I mean, in Rites, you did have, one of your characters showed up in another story. So how did that come about? While you were writing, you felt like she needed to be there, or you knew all along she was going to take part in another piece?
Well, that specific character, actually, I had the idea after I'd written Shells 2 that I wanted to show why Leanne was like that, like why she was, for lack of a better word, a bit of a broken person in how she like handles things. And so it was important for me to show how she got there. And I hope the reader can use that story to kind of inform their understanding of her character in Shells 2. Because obviously the child narrator doesn't have that context for why this woman behaves this way, why she treats her this way, and like what this woman's life was like. She just thinks she's a bitch. And like, that's not true of anybody. Like, there's always a reason why we are the way we are, how we got to where we are. And it was important to me to show that, just as kind of pulling back the curtain on this somewhat tertiary character. And I thought it would give a nice roundedness to the stories, since they all share so many different places and they share different characters and different settings. And they also share like just the entire rural aspect of it, if that makes sense. Like, place was really important, but I wanted to really pull it together in a unified way.
Yeah, and I appreciated it too, because I had one assumption about, her trajectory. And so seeing that it was a little bit different than what I thought it would be, I did appreciate seeing that or reading that.
Thank you.
So the current state of writing, I guess, has changed a little bit now with the advent of social media, right? So I read about someone who has compiled like a series of tweets and has people who view these tweets, and she's telling a story. Actually, even one of them has been made into a movie, which I really did like, right? But yeah, it was great.
Theater.
Do you think you'd be able to do something like that?
I don't think I would be very good at doing like a tweet thread of stories like that. I mean, I think if I were to approach it as pure fiction, like, because I mean, obviously that happened to Zola in large part with, some special spice to make it more fun for the reader. But I think if I were to imagine it from a character, I might be able to do it, because I think especially like with Twitter, you have to have a very distinct voice. And like, I don't think me, Savannah Johnston, is the person to be able to really lean into that voice. I think I could do it fictionally, but it would have to be from a different perspective than my own. I mean, we've been talking here, I tend to ramble, and 140 characters is the limit.
That'll stop the rambling.
Exactly, which is why mostly what I use my Twitter for is like for writing, for connecting with the literary community, and for jokes, because they're easier to make than creating an entire constructed narrative. And Zola, she's hilarious, and she's obviously still on Twitter, and she just has that ability to just tell a story in 30 words. Like, I've written some Flash, but it's not my strong suit. And I think if you're really good at it, like she is, then get it, do it, tell those stories. Like, I follow a bunch of tweet threads. An author I follow, Sarah Benincasa, she's been listening to an audiobook that's a biography of Leonardo da Vinci, and she's also a comedian. And so she's basically live tweeting this audiobook about Leonardo da Vinci's fabulous gay life. And it's really funny and it's incredible. And like, I think there are jokes, and I think some parts of my book are funny, but I'm not that funny. And that's not my strong suit. So I will leave it to the experts, and I will click follow.
Yeah. I have a problem with the editing process. I'd want to take things back and revise them. And once that's out there, you can't.
Nope. Somebody screenshotted it. They'll know.
Right. All right. Well, I thank you for the time that we've had. I think we're getting to the end piece. So I guess Javier will come back in.
Yeah, thank you for coming, truly. And I really enjoyed speaking with you.
It was awesome.
Thank you, guys. Thanks, Savannah and David, for joining us tonight. That was a great conversation, and you can keep watching as the days go by. It'll be up on our website and on our YouTube channel. Make sure to look at it again every single day and buy multiple books every time you watch it. You can purchase books through David Press, which I believe Kristen listed that in the chat. Buy to your heart's content. The holidays are right around the corner. There it is. It's a fantastic collection. We're so happy to have you here, Savannah. And I'm glad that your publicist approached us about this. So thanks everyone for showing up tonight. And thank you all for participating. Yes, it was a great event, and yeah.
Special.
Thank you.
All right. Have a good night, everyone. Thank
Yes.
you.
Thanks.
Right.
Bye-bye now.
Bye.